The Tundra Station sat as a forgotten relic, a monument to humanity's overconfidence, clinging to life on a planet that wished it gone. Outside, the storm raged like an animal, clawing at the station's reinforced walls, tearing at its seams. Frost clung to the windows like desperate fingers trying to steal the warmth within. Inside, Jace Kyler sat hunched over a console, his gloved fingers rhythmically tapping the metal surface, syncing with his thoughts. Routine. Everything at Tundra Station revolved around it. Daily scans, system checks, solitary meals in the mess hall, and the sound of his own breath echoing off metal walls. Routine kept people alive, but it slowly gnawed at their sanity. Jace rubbed his stubbled chin and stared at the static-filled display. The storm outside had been relentless for hours, a vicious vortex of ice and wind capable of stripping flesh from bone in minutes. The sensors hummed faintly, sweeping the area, blind and unreliable. Then came a strange blip, an anomaly in the dead air. His pulse quickened. It came again, a flicker at the edge of the eastern perimeter. He frowned and leaned closer to the console. Probably just interference, he muttered, adjusting the sensitivity of the scanners. The storm was notorious for wreaking havoc with electronics, but the signal persisted, a small, erratic blip in the swirling chaos. He narrowed his eyes. This wasn't a glitch. Jace isolated the signal and studied the data stream. It was faint but unmistakable. There was life out there, and that was impossible. No one survived in the storm. He hesitated. Reporting it to Central Command would only bring bureaucracy and no answers. They'd tell him it was just a glitch. He glanced at the clock. 6 more hours of shift. 6 more hours of wondering what that signal was. Jace grabbed his parka and holstered his pulse pistol. Stupid, he muttered under his breath. It's probably nothing. The station's door hissed open, and the wind slammed into him like a physical blow. Cold wasn't the right word. The storm on this planet was an anti-life force, tearing through his insulated suit as though it wasn't even there. His visor flickered, struggling to keep a visual through the icy air, but Jace kept moving. He didn't even need to look. The white, barren landscape was endless, cruel. The wind howled, almost drowning out the sound of his boots crunching through the snow. His helmet's interface guided him to the coordinates of the signal. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow through the blizzard. He squinted through the haze, heart racing. It was a woman. She staggered, her movements erratic, like a puppet with broken strings. Her skin was a deep, rich purple, a stark contrast against the white world around her. She wore a thin, silver shawl, its fabric clinging to her like frozen silk. Her midnight black hair was slick with ice, framing a face that was both beautiful and unsettling. Her amber eyes locked onto him with desperate intensity. "Human," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the storm's roar. "I'm freezing." Jace froze. His pulse thudded in his ears. Was this a hallucination? Was it a trick of the storm? No. She was real. Real enough that her bare feet were half buried in the snow. "Damn it," he hissed, pushing past his disbelief. He shrugged off his parka and rushed toward her. "Here, take this." The wind snatched the words from his lips as he draped the coat around her. Her skin was like ice, almost unnatural. How was she alive? The woman shuddered violently as she clutched the parka, her body shaking uncontrollably. "I was looking for you," she whispered. The words hit Jace like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. "What?" His gaze shot around, but there was only the storm. Her lips parted again, but before she could speak, she collapsed, falling forward into his arms. Jace instinctively caught her, her body light as a feather, but icy cold to the touch. Every instinct screamed at him to let her go, but he ignored them, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. "Hang on," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Don't die on me." The trek back to the station was grueling. The wind fought him, the snow pulling at his legs like chains. The woman's head rested against his chest, her hair whipping across his face. But Jace held on, every step an eternity, until the station's door hissed open, and warmth flooded his senses. He barely made it inside, collapsing to his knees as the airlock sealed behind him. His breath was ragged as he laid her down on the infirmary cot, peeling off his frosted gloves. The woman's lips were still blue, her breath shallow. Jace grabbed a thermal blanket and wrapped it around her, his hands shaking slightly as he tucked it in. He hovered nearby, waiting for any sign of life. And then, her amber eyes fluttered open. "Alive," she whispered, her voice stronger now, carrying a strange, melodic accent. "You brought me in?" Jace straightened, crossing his arms. "You're lucky I found you. What the hell were you doing out there?" A faint, unsettling smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It was equal parts gratitude and something else, a mystery. "I was searching for you." Jace frowned. "For me? You don't even know who I am." The woman's gaze never wavered as she spoke softly. "I do. Jace Kyler." The mention of his name sent an inexplicable chill down his spine. "How do you know that?" She sat up slightly, the blanket slipping away to reveal her violet skin, now flushed with warmth. "It doesn't matter. You saved me." Her eyes glowed faintly. "And I repay my debts." Jace swallowed hard. Unease crept up his spine. "What do you mean by that?" She tilted her head, amusement glinting in her eyes. "You'll see." The howling wind outside seemed so far away as silence filled the room. Jace couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn he couldn't understand. Zara, the alien woman, sat on the cot, her posture poised, her amber eyes glowing faintly. She seemed alive with a purpose, as though the storm outside didn't even matter. Jace's voice was filled with skepticism. "Why me? Why would you be looking for me, princess?" She smiled faintly, the mysterious edge to her expression only deepening. "I owe you a debt." His gaze flickered over her skin, tracing the glowing patterns running beneath it, lines like constellations etched into her form. "You said that already." Zara's smile grew subtle but knowing. "You saved me. You'll understand soon enough." Jace's unease deepened. "I don't need a reward. I just did what anyone would have done." Zara's eyes flashed with something sharp, her voice turning colder. "Not everyone would have stepped into the storm to save a stranger. But you did, and for that, I repay you." She leaned forward slightly, her posture shifting as though she were testing the limits of her regained strength. The silver markings along her arms glowed brighter. "It is necessary." Jace took a step back, heart pounding. "I don't." Zara's voice was low and soft as she moved closer, her violet skin shimmering in the dim light. "To refuse it is to refuse balance." "Balance?" Jace's voice faltered. "What does that mean?" Her hand lifted slowly, brushing against his chest, and Jace's breath hitched. The warmth of her touch cut through the chill of the room like a knife. "I reward you," she murmured, her voice sinking deep beneath his skin. "Women like me repay debts by offering what we hold most precious, ourselves." Jace's body froze, his breath shallow as he met her unblinking gaze. "I don't understand." "It is our way," Zara whispered, her hand slowly moving to the base of his neck, her touch lingering like fire. "To refuse it is to refuse honor." Jace's heart raced as everything inside him screamed to pull away. But Zara stood close now, her amber eyes full of ancient understanding and a promise of something that would change everything. Chapter 2. The Gift and the Consequence. The sterile hum of the Tundra Station's infirmary filled the silence, a hollow sound that did little to drown the pounding in Jace Kyler's chest. His heart thudded, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that twisted in his gut with every heartbeat. Zara stood before him, her violet skin glowing faintly in the dim light, her amber eyes fixed on his with an unnerving intensity. Every step she took seemed calculated, deliberate, and yet it felt as if she moved in a way that defied human comprehension, like a predator stalking prey, or something else entirely. Jace wanted to step back, to create space between them. His mind screamed at him to keep control, to not let the strange alien woman destabilize everything he knew. But every time he tried to move, something held him still, something primal in her gaze that made him hesitate. Her fingers, delicate yet unyielding, brushed against the base of his neck, sending a shock of warmth through him. The warmth that radiated from her skin was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't the warmth of a person who had simply been outside in the cold for too long. It was a deep, almost unnatural heat, as though her very being was a living furnace. "You're not just a stranger, are you?" Jace's voice broke the silence, sounding rough and uncertain, even to his own ears. He didn't know why he asked the question. Maybe he was looking for an answer that would make this all make sense. Or maybe he just wanted to hear her confirm the suspicion that had been growing inside him ever since she'd whispered his name. Jace Kyler. Zara's smile was faint but knowing, as if she had already seen this question coming, already knew it would be asked. "I am not a stranger to you, Jace Kyler. Not anymore." Her words hit him harder than he expected, a cold, creeping realization that something about this encounter was far more than random chance. The storm outside, the blip on the sensor, her appearance in the blizzard, it all felt far too calculated, too intentional. But why him? Why had she sought him out? The air between them felt charged, electric. It was as if Zara was waiting for something. Something that would unlock the meaning behind her presence in this cold, isolated place. Jace didn't know if he was ready to find out. "You've already told me you're repaying a debt," Jace said, trying to steady his nerves. "But repaying a debt? What does that really mean? What are you offering me? What's the catch?" Zara tilted her head, and for a fleeting moment, Jace saw a flicker of something soft in her eyes. "The debt is not as simple as you think, Jace Kyler. It is not something you can repay in the traditional sense. I do not seek a trade of favors. What I offer is not something you can bargain for. It is part of my nature." Jace's brow furrowed, confused. "Nature? What does that even mean?" Zara took a step closer, and her presence seemed to fill the room. The warmth around her intensified, but it wasn't the oppressive heat of a fever. It was something else entirely. It felt ancient, alive. "I told you," Zara said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "I repay my debts with what I hold most precious. My people. We honor life debts by offering ourselves, body and soul. It is not servitude, Jace, but honor. A bond." Jace's breath caught in his throat. "You're telling me you're offering yourself? To me?" Zara's amber eyes darkened slightly, the glow in them becoming more pronounced, more intense. "I am," she said simply. "What I offer you is my life, in the deepest sense. It is a gift, but it is also a burden. You must choose, Jace. Accept it, and your life will never be the same. Deny it, and it will haunt you." Jace shook his head, taking a step back. His mind was spinning, trying to process the enormity of what she was offering, or demanding. He was a soldier, a survivor, not some chosen one. There was no way he could accept something like this. He didn't know her. He barely understood her. "You don't understand," Jace said, his voice hoarse. "You can't just offer yourself like that. I'm not some hero. I didn't do this for some reward. I just did what anyone would do." Zara's smile softened, but there was a sadness in her gaze that chilled him. "No, Jace Kyler, you did not do it for a reward. But you did it because it is part of your nature too. To step into the storm, to offer your help without thinking of the consequences. That is why I seek you, and that is why I offer myself." Jace's mind raced, the words she spoke digging deeper into him with every passing second. Why him? What was it about him that had drawn her here, to this forgotten outpost in the middle of nowhere, at the edge of the galaxy? He had no answers, only questions, and the eerie feeling that this strange woman had been watching him long before they had ever met. "Why me?" Jace muttered, his voice almost breaking. Zara reached out, her hand resting gently on his chest again, just over his heart. "Because you are not just a human, Jace. You are something more. You've always been more. And we have been waiting for you." Jace's pulse quickened, his breath shallow. The room seemed to close in on him as Zara's fingers traced the outline of his chest, each touch sending a strange jolt through him. Her skin was so cold, yet there was a fire inside her that seemed to burn through everything, melting the ice in the air, melting the walls he had built around himself. I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara leaned in, her amber eyes never leaving his. I know you do not. But you will. It is in your blood, Jace. Your destiny. And when you understand, you will know that accepting this gift will change everything. For both of us, Jace felt a sharp pang of fear in his chest. This wasn't just about saving her from the storm anymore. This was something far bigger, far more dangerous. And yet, despite the gnawing fear inside him, there was a part of him that wanted to know what came next, that wanted to understand the promise Zara had just made. I can't, Jace said, almost pleading with himself. I don't want to be part of some cosmic fate. I'm just a man, a soldier. Zara's gaze softened, and she moved even closer, her body so close now that he could feel the heat of her, even through the cold of the station. You are always more than just a soldier, Jace Kyler. You've always been part of something much bigger. Jace's heart hammered in his chest as he looked at the woman before him. An alien, a stranger who had somehow known him in ways he couldn't fathom. His thoughts were tangled, emotions raw and conflicting. He wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't. Not anymore. You've already stepped into the storm, Jace, Zara whispered, her voice a soft promise. And now, you must face what comes after. The air in the room seemed to hold its breath, and in that moment, Jace knew there was no going back. His fate and Zara's were bound together in a way he couldn't escape. Whether he wanted it or not, his life was about to change forever. Chapter 3: The Choice. Jace stood frozen in the dim glow of the infirmary, Zara's amber eyes like burning embers, pulling him in. Her presence filled the room, too close, too intense, and every instinct in him screamed to pull away, to run. But there was nowhere to go. She was already inside his head, her words echoing like a strange melody in his mind. You have to make a choice, she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of something ancient, something deeply rooted in her alien nature. The storm outside is nothing compared to the storm that is coming for both of us. You feel it, don't you? The shift in the air, the weight of what has begun. Jace didn't know how to respond. His mind was in chaos, trying to untangle the mess of questions that kept spinning faster and faster. Why me? What does she want? He had been a soldier, a man trained to make quick decisions, but this was different. This was beyond his understanding, beyond anything his training had prepared him for. You saved me, Jace Kyler, Zara continued, stepping even closer. Her voice was soft now, almost coaxing. In doing so, you awakened something within both of us. It cannot be undone. She was too close, the heat of her body unsettling against the chill of the station. He could feel the hum of her presence, as if her very being was vibrating with energy. His pulse thudded in his ears as he struggled to make sense of it all. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. His throat felt dry, constricted, as if the weight of the moment had turned his entire body to stone. Zara, sensing his hesitation, reached out again, this time with both hands, her fingers wrapping gently around his wrists. Her touch was colder now, the strange warmth that had surrounded her replaced by a frigidness that seemed to pulse beneath her skin. What the hell was happening to her? He thought, but the question faded as he felt the pull of her presence once more. Jace, she whispered, leaning in close enough that he could feel her breath, cold and steady against his ear. You've always been a part of this, haven't you? You may not remember yet, but you were chosen long before today. This is not an accident. This is fate. Jace tried to pull away, to regain control, but her grip tightened, gentle yet unyielding. He looked into her eyes, searching for something, anything, to make sense of her cryptic words. But all he found were layers upon layers of mystery. Stop, he said, his voice rough, desperate. I don't know what you're talking about. This isn't what I signed up for. I saved you. That's all. That's all I'm supposed to do. You're not my responsibility. Zara's face softened, her gaze never leaving his. There was an odd tenderness in her eyes now, a flicker of something that seemed almost human. You think this is about responsibility? She asked, her voice quieter now, more introspective. No, Jace, it's about something much bigger. You didn't save me out of obligation. You saved me because you knew you had to. Because that is who you are. Deep down, you've always known. Jace's chest tightened, as if the walls of the room were closing in around him. He tried to move, to pull away from her grip, but her hands, though delicate, held him with a strength that left him no room to escape. "I didn't," he began, but the words faltered on his lips. The more he tried to deny it, the more he felt the weight of what she said pressing down on him. Was it true? Had he known all along that something had been calling to him? Something that had led him to this moment? "I don't know what's happening," Jace admitted, his voice quieter now, barely more than a whisper. "But I don't want to be part of this. Whatever it is." Zara's lips parted, a faint smile gracing them, but it was not one of amusement. It was the kind of smile that spoke of understanding, of knowing something that he didn't. "I never said you had a choice, Jace," she replied, her tone almost affectionate. "But you do, in a way. You can choose how to face this, how to accept the truth that has been written in the stars long before you and I ever met." Jace closed his eyes, trying to block out the chaos of thoughts swirling in his head. The whole universe felt like it was pressing down on him, suffocating him with its weight. He was just a man. He had just wanted to survive this cold, isolated outpost, do his job, and get back to something that resembled normality. But this woman, this alien, had come into his life and turned it upside down. He opened his eyes to meet Zara's gaze once more. Her eyes, glowing faintly with that eerie amber light, were full of expectation, as if she were waiting for him to say the one thing that would set everything in motion. "I didn't ask for this," Jace said, the words slipping from his mouth before he could stop them. "I didn't ask for you to be here, for any of this to happen." Zara's expression softened, and she nodded slowly, understanding in her gaze. "I know, but the storm, Jace, the storm is just the beginning. It's only just started." Jace took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something much deeper, something that ran through the very fabric of his existence. He thought of the cold, relentless storm outside, of the outpost's sterile walls, and of the flickering sensors that had led him to Zara in the first place. What had he really stepped into? What kind of life, or death, had he just chosen for himself? "I didn't ask for any of this," he repeated, more to himself than to her, his voice full of frustration and resignation. "But I'm not leaving you out there again." Zara's smile deepened, and her grip on his wrists loosened just enough for him to breathe again. "You don't need to, Jace," she said, her voice soft but certain. "You've already made the choice. Now all that's left is to understand it." She took a step back, releasing him fully. Her eyes never left his, as if she were watching for any sign of hesitation, any moment when he might pull away. But Jace didn't move. Something had changed. Something inside him was different now, and no matter how much he wanted to deny it, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The storm outside howled against the walls of the outpost, but inside, it was eerily still. In that silence, Jace Kyler knew that whatever came next, he would never be the same, and neither would Zara. Chapter 4: The Rising Tide. The silence in the infirmary pressed down on Jace like a heavy weight, suffocating him in the tension that hung between him and Zara. His breath came out in short, sharp bursts as he tried to process what had just happened. His pulse pounded in his temples, and every inch of his body screamed for escape, for clarity. But there was nowhere to run. There was no way out of this strange, cold reality he had been thrust into. Zara remained still, her amber eyes locked on him with an intensity that felt almost predatory. She hadn't moved, hadn't said a word since he'd made his choice. But Jace could feel the change. He could feel the weight of destiny settling over him like a thick fog. The choice he had made, whether conscious or not, had shifted something inside of him. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered again, trying to steady himself, but the words lost their power, falling flat as they hit the sterile air. He wasn't sure who he was trying to convince anymore, Zara or himself. Zara's lips curled into a soft smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "You're not the first to say that," she replied, her voice quiet, almost reflective. "In fact, it's almost always the first thing that happens. You think you're making a decision, but in reality, you're just following a path that's already been laid out for you." Her words were like a quiet hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, vibrating in a way he couldn't ignore. Jace shook his head, fighting the urge to pull away. I don't understand. What do you mean? Zara's gaze softened for a moment, and she stepped closer, her movements graceful, measured. It's the way of our kind, she began, her voice almost wistful. We don't choose our paths, not in the way you do. We are guided. From the moment of our birth, we are bound to something greater, something older. And when we find our counterpart, her voice trailed off, and Jace felt the strange pull of her presence wrap around him again. He wanted to step back, to break free of the magnetic force that seemed to keep him rooted in place, but he couldn't. Counterpart? He asked, his voice hoarse. You mean me? Zara's lips twitched in a knowing smile. Yes, Jace. You are mine, and I am yours. Our bond was formed long before we met, long before this storm ever raged outside these walls. We are bound by something deeper than space or time. The words felt heavy, impossibly heavy, like chains sinking into his bones. He felt a chill creep up his spine, despite the warmth of the infirmary around him. This can't be real. This can't be happening. But Zara's eyes, glowing softly in the dim light, told him otherwise. They were like windows to a place he couldn't quite see, but felt inexplicably connected to. His voice was barely a whisper. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for you. Her expression faltered for a moment, but only for a moment. The faintest flicker of something, maybe sadness, maybe something darker, passed through her eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the calm certainty she always seemed to carry with her. You never do, Jace, she said softly. But that doesn't change the truth. Jace's mind reeled, his thoughts a tangled mess of confusion and doubt. He had lived his entire life making choices based on survival, on what was necessary to keep going, to keep moving forward. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't sure if he was the one making the decisions anymore, or if the world around him had already decided his fate. I don't get it, he muttered, rubbing his hands over his face in frustration. What am I supposed to do now? Zara tilted her head, as if considering his question. You'll do what is required of you, she said, her voice firm now, as though the matter had already been settled. We both will. Jace shook his head, looking at the walls of the infirmary as if they could offer him answers. His thoughts were still scattered, still desperately searching for some kind of grip, something he could hold on to. But every time he thought he had a clear thought, Zara's words would slip in, pulling him deeper into a reality that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling up inside him. And what's that supposed to mean? What does it even mean that we're what? Bound? Zara's eyes flickered with something. Perhaps recognition, perhaps a hint of something far more ancient than he could comprehend. She stepped closer, so close that Jace could feel the heat radiating off of her. The subtle glow of her markings, the silver lines that traced her skin, seemed to pulse in rhythm with her breath. We are not bound by choice, Jace, she said softly. We are bound by blood, by something older than any of us. And when the storm comes, when the tide rises, we will have to face it together. You and I. Jace took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. I don't understand what you're saying. Zara's expression softened once again, but it was laced with something darker now, something almost predatory. Then let me show you. Before he could react, she moved faster than he could follow, her body gliding toward him with a fluid grace that left him no time to prepare. She caught his wrist again, her grip tight, unyielding. You feel it, don't you? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet the words cut through the air like a blade. The storm is already here, Jace. It's already begun. And we are the ones it will come for. Jace's stomach lurched as the air around him seemed to shift. The temperature in the room dropped, the warm glow of the infirmary's lights flickering. Something was happening, something that felt out of his control. Zara's eyes locked onto his, her gaze steady, unblinking. You will have to choose again, Jace, she said, her voice low and almost predatory now. You will have to decide whether you are willing to pay the price for what comes next. Jace stared at her, the weight of her words sinking deep into his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn away, to break free from her grip. but deep down he knew. He knew that there was no escape. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was rising between them. And for better or worse, Jace Kyler was already too far in to back out now. Chapter 5. The Shifting Currents. The air in the infirmary felt thick, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Jace stood frozen, caught between Zara's unyielding grip and the storm that seemed to rage inside his own mind. Every part of him wanted to pull away, to run, but some unseen force, kept him rooted to the spot. Zara's presence, her proximity, it was magnetic, dangerous, unavoidable. Her grip on his wrist tightened, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the burn of her skin, cool, almost like ice, yet somehow warm against his pulse. The odd sensation made his chest tighten, a swirl of dread and desire he couldn't explain. He tried to shake it off, tried to refocus on the reality he knew. This was insane. He didn't know what Zara wanted, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to be caught up in something bigger than himself. "You feel it, don't you?" Zara repeated, her voice a murmur that slid beneath his skin, making him shiver despite the warmth in the room. "The storm outside is nothing compared to the one inside you. But you're not ready to face it, are you, Jace?" Her eyes were glowing with that strange, amber intensity, and for a second, he felt himself falling into them, caught in her gaze like prey in a trap. His heart pounded in his ears, and the very air around him seemed to shift with the weight of her words. "I'm not ready for any of this," he muttered, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "This isn't me. I don't even know who you are." Zara tilted her head, a faint smile curling at the corners of her lips. It was both soothing and terrifying, like the calm before a storm that would tear everything apart. "You'll learn who I am, Jace. You'll understand in time, but there's no time to waste. The storm is here, and it won't wait for you to catch up." Jace tried to pull his wrist free, but Zara's grip was firm, unyielding. It wasn't painful, but it was a reminder of how small he was in the face of whatever this was. "You keep saying that. The storm. What does it mean? What do you want from me?" Zara's eyes flickered with something dark, something ancient. "I don't want anything from you, Jace. But the storm, it comes for us all in different ways. It's coming for you now." Her words made his blood run cold. The weight of her meaning hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jace stepped back, trying to create some space between them, but it wasn't enough. He could still feel her presence closing in, suffocating, unavoidable. "Storms," Zara continued, her tone softer now, more like a lullaby than the edge of danger. "They come in many forms. Some are physical, like the one outside. Others are more personal, internal." She let go of his wrist, but her fingers lingered, tracing a light path up his arm. "You've already felt it. The pull, the connection, the way your body responds to mine." Jace's heart skipped a beat at her touch. The coldness of her skin was like fire against his skin, electric and consuming. He jerked away, but Zara was already too close. She was always too close. "No," he shook his head, trying to focus, trying to get his thoughts straight. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't feel any connection to you. And I don't care about your storm." His voice was growing more desperate now, but he couldn't stop the anxiety crawling up his spine. "I don't want any of this." Zara didn't back off. Instead, she leaned in, her face mere inches from his. The sweet scent of frost and something alien, something heady and intoxicating, filled his senses. She didn't speak right away, just studied him, as if she was searching for something deep inside of him. "You think you don't want this," Zara murmured, her breath warm against his cheek. "But you're wrong. You've always wanted it, Jace. You just haven't realized it yet. That's the storm, the awakening. It's inside you, buried so deep that you can't even recognize it. But I can see it. I can feel it." Jace closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, trying to shake off the dizziness that was clouding his thoughts. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. He wasn't some chosen person in some cosmic drama that Zara was pulling him into. He wasn't some hero for some ancient, alien cause. He was just a man trying to survive in a broken, frozen world. But Zara's words echoed in his mind, filling the empty spaces with doubt. You've always wanted it. The words gnawed at him. Could it be true? Had he been running from something his whole life? A feeling, a need he didn't understand? He opened his eyes and met her gaze again, forcing himself to stand firm, to not let the unease that was crawling beneath his skin overwhelm him. I don't care. I'm not part of whatever this is. I don't want to be. Zara's smile was slow and knowing. She stepped back, and for a moment, Jace thought she might leave him alone. But the air in the room was still thick, still charged with the weight of something waiting to happen. The storm doesn't care about your desires, Jace, she said softly, her voice like the distant rumble of thunder. It doesn't care if you want it or not. It's coming for you. For us. And whether you're ready or not, you're going to have to face it. Jace swallowed, feeling his heart rate spike again. He wanted to argue, to tell her that none of this made sense, but the words caught in his throat. He felt something pulling at him, something far beyond logic, far beyond understanding. It was as if Zara had unlocked a door inside him, one he didn't even know existed. He looked down at his hands, trying to steady himself, but the tremors wouldn't stop. His mind raced, trying to find a way out, but there was no way to escape. Not anymore. The storm had already come, and it was only a matter of time before it claimed them both. Zara stepped closer again, her voice low and steady, as though she were speaking to him from a great distance, though her lips were just inches from his ear. You'll see, Jace. You'll understand soon enough. The storm is coming, and you'll either stand with me, or it will tear you apart. Jace closed his eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he had a choice. Chapter 6. The Eye of the Storm. Jace didn't know how much time had passed since Zara's words had sunk into him. The storm outside still raged, howling against the walls of the outpost, but inside, there was a different kind of quiet, a heavy silence filled with anticipation. Every tick of the clock seemed to pulse with the growing tension in the room. Zara was still there, still watching him, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, and every movement she made seemed to shift the air around them. He couldn't escape her gaze, couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life had led to this moment. No matter how hard he tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that this was just another bizarre turn in an already strange life, he couldn't deny the pull between them. It was like a current, tugging him under, making his thoughts falter and his resolve waver. You're afraid, Zara said softly, her voice smooth and knowing as it slid over him like velvet. But it's okay to be afraid. The storm inside you is the hardest to face. But it's there, Jace, and it's waiting for you. Enough with the damn storm, Jace snapped, frustration building in his chest. He had heard that phrase a dozen times in the last few hours, and it was beginning to drive him mad. What does it even mean? What do you want from me? Zara smiled, and for a brief moment, Jace saw something vulnerable behind her amber eyes, a flicker of something human. But it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. She took a step toward him, her movements fluid, almost graceful, like a predator closing in on its prey. I don't want anything from you, Jace, she replied softly. I want you to embrace what you are, what you've always been, what you've always needed. Jace took a step back, shaking his head. I'm not like you. I don't. His voice faltered as a strange sensation washed over him. It was subtle at first, just a warmth spreading through his chest, but then it grew, pulsing beneath his skin like something alive. He looked down, his breath catching as the silver lines on Zara's skin, the same patterns he had noticed earlier, began to glow brighter, as though they were responding to his own heartbeat. What is this? He breathed, barely able to keep his voice steady. He felt like he was on the edge of something immense and dangerous, and if he took one wrong step, he'd be consumed by it. Zara's smile grew wider, almost triumphant. You feel it now, don't you? The connection. The storm. It's within you, Jace. It's always been there, waiting for you to accept it. You're not human anymore. Jace shook his head, panic creeping into his chest. No, this isn't happening. I'm not one of you. But even as the words left his mouth, he couldn't help but feel the truth of them. Something was changing. The air in the room seemed to pulse with energy, and his own body was responding in ways he couldn't explain. He felt lighter, almost like the gravity of the outpost had lessened, and his thoughts were becoming disjointed. Fragments of his past, his training, his survival instincts, all swirling together into something new. Zara stepped closer, and this time, Jace didn't move away. There was no room to retreat. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek, and the warmth from her skin spread like fire through his veins. "This is what I meant," Zara whispered. "You don't have to fight it. You can't escape it. You are part of the storm now. You've always been." Jace's mind spun as his heart pounded. His body felt foreign to him, like it was no longer his own. The silver lines that adorned Zara's skin flickered against his own, like an echo, and his breath caught in his throat. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that his life, his identity, was about to change forever. Suddenly, everything in the room went still. The humming of the outpost systems, the howling of the wind outside, the beating of his heart, all of it seemed to stop, as though time had frozen. "You're ready," Zara's voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the soft, teasing lilt she had used before. It was a command, a decree. Jace felt a sudden pressure in his chest, a pull like something was ripping at him from the inside. His skin itched, his muscles screamed in protest, and he gasped for air. His body was fighting whatever transformation was overtaking it, but he could feel the inevitable closing in on him. It wasn't just Zara's presence that had changed the air. It was the storm inside him, the one he had been running from his entire life. Zara's hand rested on his chest now, warm and steady. Her touch was like a promise. "Let go, Jace," she whispered, her voice reverberating in his mind. "Let the storm in. Let it consume you." His vision blurred, the room around him spinning as his body began to respond to her words. The silver lines on his skin started to pulse in rhythm with the storm, with Zara, with everything. He felt the power, the energy, rising up inside him, and for a fleeting moment, he understood. It wasn't just a transformation. It was a rebirth, and there was no turning back. The pain that had gripped him a moment before melted away, replaced by a strange, burning clarity. His mind expanded, his senses sharpened. He could feel the storm outside, could hear its howl as if it were a song. He could feel the pulse of Zara's energy mingling with his own, a perfect synchronization that made everything else fade into insignificance. Zara stepped back, her eyes glowing brighter now. "Welcome to the storm, Jace," she said, her voice both an invitation and a warning. "You're no longer just a man. You are something more." Jace could feel the truth of her words settle in his chest, deep and unshakable. He had crossed a threshold, and whatever had been waiting for him on the other side, it was here. The storm had claimed him, and there was no way to know where it would take him next.